Thanks for coming today, and welcome to the first African Studies lecture series of winter quarter. This is our fourth of this academic year, and we actually have 5 more planned through May. So hopefully this is not your first or your last one of this year. But today we are very excited to have Dr. Steven Rubert from Oregon State University, just up the road in Corvallis, joining us to deliver a talk about the environmental history of Zimbabwe's Highveld. So I want to say thank you to our sponsors of the African Studies Lecture Series, partly African Studies Program, Global Oregon, and many departments on campus, including History and Anthropology and International Studies. So a little bit of background about Dr. Steve Rubert. He studied history and political science as an undergraduate at Cal State University Northridge and got his PhD from UCLA and is very familiar with UCLA from what I can hear. He spent 21 years at Oregon State University, so he's a long-term Oregonian at this point. And not only is he working on a current study of healthcare systems in colonial Zimbabwe, but he's also published the book called A Most Promising Weed, A History of Tobacco Farming and Labor in Colonial Zimbabwe, and articles on tobacco farming and wage labor. So I consider him both an economic historian and an environmental historian, and maybe also a medical historian based on this new project. A social historian. Social historian covers it all. So we're very grateful to have him participating today, and we look forward to your lecture. Thank you.
If any of you are lecturers, you'll know getting applause before is so totally out of what students do. It's usually at the end. If you end early, they applaud, maybe, if you're lucky. But although a couple years ago I fell at home, I cut my foot under something like this and bashed my head on the edge of a fireplace and ended up with 15 stitches, and my nose was, that was a Thursday evening, and I walked into class on Monday, and for the first time in years, it just went dead silent. And I finally said, doesn't anyone have the guts to ask what happened? And then, oh, well, what happened? I fell. I was a klutz. I think the easiest way, rather than going back and forth, is, if these even show up. I tried to get these the best I can do. This dark area through the middle, I'll just start with the Highveld. Where are my manners? I want to thank the organizers, Melissa, and the other people here for inviting me here. I'm very excited that U of O is doing this. It's I think when I was hired 21 years ago, I was told I was the only Africanist in the state. I don't know how true exactly that was. Down there they don't recognize up here, and I think it goes the other way. But I think it's wonderful what they're doing here and the program they're putting together and building, and they should be congratulated. So my congratulations for what it's worth. I've been going to Zimbabwe since the mid-'80s, early '80s really. I was part of the first contingent of foreign scholars that was allowed into Zimbabwe after the revolution in 1984, and I've been back and forth not as often as I hoped, but long enough to be, I've been a research associate the last few times with the Department of Economic History, which broke off from the Department of History, I don't know, probably 15 years ago now. But anyway, so this whole environmental thing's a little new to me. This is the second time I've sort of tried to talk about it. But this Highveld, sometimes called the Central Plateau in Zimbabwean history, is this dark area that runs from the southwest towards the northeast, and is really I'll give you some more detail on it. But, okay, now I have to figure out how to make this go away. No. Here we go. I also brought, I'll mention, that's not going to show up good. Those are kopis in southern Africa. Kopje. They're these giant granite outcroppings that often, those boulders are just sitting on each other. In Zimbabwe, they say, I'm never going to get to my talk. They say in Zimbabwe that they get like that when a young man wants to marry a young woman and her family's not sure, how good a farmer he might be, how he can provide. So at night, he goes up and piles the rocks like that to show how strong he is. It works for me. My wife is still waiting for her pile of rocks, I'm afraid. But let me see. I'll try one more to see. Now, hopefully, these are too dark, so I'll bypass them. I got them. You can see that the Highveld, it's called a plateau, but it really is made up to a very large extent from in the I'll just leave that. Well, let me just do this paper and we'll do it that way. Can you tell I get rattled? I'm sure you're aware that starting around 2000, you probably saw, and occasionally might still, it's sort of out of, an expert. Does that show up any better? No, I think it's just too dark. Oh, thanks for trying. I think it's just too dark. That's all right. We'll live. But starting around 2000, it was in the news in the West of these stories about black Zimbabweans, generally referred to as war veterans, although many of them were much too young to have fought in the War of Liberation, that lasted from 1965 to 1979 in Zimbabwe. It's called Chimurenga II. Chimurenga I was a resistance against the imposition of colonial rule in the 1890s. Oftentimes in those reports, what you would see is, of course, bloodied white farm owners, maybe a few farm workers that were bloodied by these what are called farm invasions in Zimbabwe, or the liberation of farms, depending on if you're a veteran or not. But somewhere in there you'll see a spokesman say, a government spokesman, say that, quoting President Mugabe, that the war veterans were simply reclaiming lands that had been stolen through white settlement a century before. And the implication is always clear that the land takeovers are meant to be seen as the final stage of that Chimurenga of the end of the 20th century. Historically speaking, that's both true to some extent, but it's also not true. And it's not true simply because we know that this struggle for the contestation of the Highveld, and this obviously, a lot of these comments apply to much of the whole country, but I'm looking at this particular prime agricultural environment zone in this paper that really struggles over those lands, who's going to control them, transforming that natural environment has been going on for 2,000 years minimum. So what I want to try to do very briefly here is look at 3 periods of that, very loosely defined. The pre-colonial period, which historians generally say start 100,000 years ago with the first settlements of hunter-gatherer peoples in the high plateau, the Highveld. Then a little bit about that. And then the colonial period, which goes again from about 1890, which is the invasion of white settlers and the British into the area that becomes Zimbabwe, down to technically April 18th, 1980, which is independence in Zimbabwe. And then the third period, a little bit about post-colonial, or the period of independence, and what went on to some extent in that in terms of land and its usage. And there's a tremendous amount, both on the internet and even books coming out on land reform and what's gone on in the last decade. And I don't know how much I'll get to that, but we'll see. So the Highveld itself is this physical environment that covers about 40% of the landmass of Zimbabwe. It starts, as you saw, roughly, your eyes are better than mine, in the southwest near the town is called Plumtree. It's on the border with Botswana. And then it stretches, this slow northeasterly stretch towards what are the eastern highlands of the border between Zimbabwe and Mozambique. That area, that Highveld is home to virtually most of Zimbabwe's major cities, Bulawayo in the southwest, Harare, Bindura, Mount Darwin, Shamva, Motoko. If you're a Zimbabwean, you know where those are. Of course, Harare, the capital, and then Mutare, which is in the eastern highlands, not technically part of the Highveld, but that's right on the border. In the southwest, it's about 600 feet elevation or so. And then, and it moves as it moves towards the highlands, 400 plus miles away, it gets up above 5,000 feet. I think Harare is something like 5,200 feet elevation, something like that. So it's very, very pleasant. And it heads towards, again, not really the Highveld, but it heads towards Mount Nyangani, which is more or less on the border with Mozambique, which is Zimbabwe's highest point at a little over 8,500 feet. But it has a distinction, granted, for people from the western United States, it's hardly a mountain. But certainly in Zimbabwe, it's a mountain, Zimbabwe's highest, and it has the virtue of being haunted. So it's covered with like those rock outcroppings. So you have these very large boulders that particularly children can fall between and just disappear. The man I first studied under, David Chinaiwa, after independence, he went back to Zimbabwe and worked for the Ministry of Labor, and his secretary was there with their two twin children, and they both just disappeared on the mountain. And you know, they were out of her sight for maybe 2 or 3 minutes when she realized they weren't there, and they never did find them. So it also has quicksand. So it's something of a mystical mountain. As I said, this Highveld stretches all that way for over 400 miles. The spine is the main watershed in Zimbabwe. North, the rivers basically all then drain into the Zambezi to the north, and to the south they drain into the Limpopo, the two great rivers that mark the borders of Zimbabwe. It's also that cuts across, just outside Harare, that cuts across from the northeast to the southwest is what's called the Great Dike. It's a geological feature that marks the Highveld. There was a lot of mining there. It's a prime source of chrome ore. So for instance, during the War of Independence, the United States, the Byrd Amendment broke international protocol and said, well, you know, the only other prime source is the Soviet Union, and of course we can't trade with them, they're communists. So somehow we could trade with white supremacists, but not communists, so we got our iron ore from there. As you probably know, I mean, it is Africa. Very few of those rivers run all year long. Even the Limpopo's been known to go for good stretches of it, pretty much dry in the dry season. However, much of the Highveld, particularly the northeastern part, is subtropical. Some books will even say it's Mediterranean climate, which is a result of both its high altitude, 5,400 feet, plus the fact that when the monsoon rains come up the Mozambique coast, they then come up the Zambezi Valley and actually come into Harare from the northwest. And so I think the average temperature in Harare is something like 72 degrees. And if it gets below 60, most Zimbabweans are freezing to death. So the rains come in, well, the dry season is August to October. October during it starts to get more muggy, going through the closer you get towards the beginning of November. In the colonial days, white settlers often called October suicide month, because if they were trying to make a living and they weren't very successful to a great extent, there were a lot of suicides by white settlers in October as it got muggier and muggier. The rains, if they come late, they usually come more or less beginning week or two of November. If they're after that, if you were a farmer, this pre-irrigation, and it doesn't rain, then how are you going to pay your debts? All that built up, and so you had a lot of deaths. So I suppose the environment even helped shape that, the name of that. The Highveld receives in the northeast, up to 40 inches, 27 to 40 inches of rain on average. By the time you get down in the southwest, excuse me, it's down to 23 inches, maybe less, some years. The rains come from April, like I said, November. They probably end, I've been there in August when it pours, but usually July, maybe June, they're really ending. Another note about the rains, Zimbabwe is also famous, partly because, again, of its elevation, has these tremendous lightning storms. Therefore, I know mid to late 80s, they held an international record for most deaths due to lightning strikes. It's something like 150 in one season. And that was just people. I mean, not to diminish it, but I've always thought the last thing you want to be in Zimbabwe is the head cow in a herd, because they put these bells around their necks. And, it's like they're little lightning rods. So I think cows must behave with each other so they don't get elected the head of the herd. But besides those rains, the problem with the Highveld is with much of southern Africa is that, and as a University of Zimbabwean archaeologist has pointed out, he argues that historically the Highveld is subject to drought once every 5 years. In the last decade, it's been more than that. When I first went there in the mid-'80s, they'd had a drought for 3 years. And they can be devastating. The one thing that saves much of the Highveld, and they're across southern Africa, are vlays, these areas that hold water after the rains, and they can provide sort of rudimentary irrigation. I mean, the women obviously have to carry it, but they are sources of water that last into the dry season. The area is also marked by these hills and these kopis. When I teach about Zimbabwe, I often say it's as if Mwari, the creator god of the Shona, sort of took the earth and went like this with all these boulders and some dirt and put a tree in here or there. And so you have these, some of them gigantic hills made of these very large boulder outcroppings across the area. Technically, it's a peneplain highland, which means it has undulating hills, and I wish I had better photos. I know I'm prejudiced, but I'm not sure there's a more beautiful place on earth than Zimbabwe. Oh, now I know there's Zimbabwe. Yeah, I mean, it's just, and every way out of Harare is almost different. and yet it's in the same ecological zone, but it's beautiful. Its soils range from sandy, heavy textured leach subsoils with relatively low fertility in the southwest, all the way up to brown to reddish brown soils. The volcanic soils in the northeast, they really, I mean, they are red. They're gorgeous. You almost don't mind getting dirty. They're so pretty. They tend to be pretty well drained, relatively easy to work, and have clearly, I've said for years, you can grow anything in them. Certainly under colonial rule, they grew anything and everything. I'll get to that. But pre-colonial sorghum, millet, ultimately corn. This pre-colonial period, as I said, the archaeologist Graham Kana has noted that the Highveld, and to quote him, would have been undoubtedly attractive to early human settlement. Its relatively cool, well-watered, and usually lightly wooded plains provided a generally healthy environment because of its elevation. Particularly the northeastern part tends to be, relatively speaking, malaria-free. Although I can speak from personal experience, you can get malaria working in that area, but generally it's not near as bad as on either side of the Highveld. You go from Middle Veld and then Lower Veld, and if you go out into those areas, you definitely need to take prevention for malaria. And when I got sick, as the doctor said, just because you take the pills doesn't mean the mosquitoes don't bite you. So, but you're much more likely to get sick if you get off the Highveld or out of the eastern highlands. But they're very, very rich area. So as I said, the first settlement, or well, occupation seems to be about 100,000 years ago. The last of these hunter-gatherer peoples were Khoisan peoples who have left across Zimbabwe just an amazing record of their presence there in pictographs, rock paintings, some carvings. They're absolutely beautiful. They're all over the Highveld and other parts of Zimbabwe. And they're just extraordinary. And they're still finding them. When I was back in the early 2000s, I visited a place that I had been 15 years earlier, and the guide said, oh, let's go up around here. Here's that they'd only found the year before, and they were absolutely gorgeous, and nobody knew they were there for God knows how long. Just absolutely beautiful. And of course, these people would have lived to a degree in a symbiotic relationship with the environment, hunting antelope, elephant probably, collecting insects and tubers and wild vegetables. We don't know how many hunter-gatherers there were, but clearly, as with traditional peoples like that, pretty light on the land, relatively speaking, to later generations. Somewhere around the 3rd century AD, CE, in question and answer, I have a question for somebody. Can you explain why they made that change? I have yet to figure it out. But somewhere in the 3rd century, the first Bantu-speaking people show up in the eastern highlands, or the eastern zone of modern-day Zimbabwe. Historians call these the Bambata people. They most likely entered the highland coming down on a route. We know that Bantu came down into southern Africa on the eastern side along 2 routes, one more or less along the coastal regions of what's modern-day Mozambique into South Africa. But they also, there was a second route that came down the western shore region of what's Lake Malawi into that eastern highland region, really the Highveld running into the eastern Highveld, eastern highlands. And so these were it's pretty clear that these were the first Bantu settlers. What evidence there is indicates that probably somewhere around between the 6th to 7th centuries AD. Those first Bantu settlers either began to expand the area that they were occupying, or were joined by new groups of Bantu settlers. I should note that a lot of the pre-colonial history in Zimbabwe, I don't know how many of you know Zimbabwean history, but can be pretty skewed simply by the fact that, as I'll say when I talk about the colonial period, it was occupied on the idea that it was a second Rand, that, oh, there's going to be more gold up there that's here in South Africa. And of course it wasn't, but the first settlers were absolutely positive it was, and they went anywhere and everywhere and dug up everything. Old mining sites, places like Great Zimbabwe, and of course, so what did that mean? It means the archaeological record, it was just totally skewed before anybody really had a chance to try to look at anything and say, oh, well, this came before that in the record, and this was below that, and that you could date some of these pre-colonial sites. So I honestly think there's a lot more sort of around, probably about, maybe in early pre-colonial Zimbabwean history than there is in the history of much of the rest of Africa. So that's why I'm a little hedging on some of these dates. We do know that these first Bantu settlers would have brought millet and sorghum with them, probably cowpeas, sort of a black-eyed pea, relative of a black-eyed pea. They were also clearly the first to bring ironworking into the plateau, and all that meant, and probably cattle keeping. Those very first settlers. We certainly know later on that the other Bantu settlers did bring in more cattle. By the 5th century, 4th, 5th century, we know that they had settled, Bantu had settled most of, particularly the prime areas of the Highveld. And as one historian says, during that period, they began to undermine the ability of Khoisan hunter-gatherers to maintain an autonomous economic presence in the same regions. Of course, it used to be thought that Khoisan lands were conquered. We now know that, or now believe anyway, that it was much more of a relationship where they're either brought into Bantu culture or make a choice to leave. It obviously wasn't an armed struggle by these people. It's probably not until the 900s, to continue this story, that what we historians call the Proto Shona, or the people that will become Shona speakers, the main ethnic linguistic group in Zimbabwe, move into the Highveld. Probably from the Transvaal, probably from the south. It's pretty clear that these are the people that introduce extensive cattle keeping into the Highveld, and mixed agriculture with that, obviously. There's oral evidence that indicates that cattle keeping with these Shona peoples, or pre-Shona, Proto-Shona peoples, by the end of the first millennium after Christ is cattle is involved in every aspect of their culture, from lobolo, bride price, to clientage, political authority, all is dictated by cattle. There's also, by about 1,000, that's supported. It's called the leopard's cope industry. It's a form of pottery that right around 1,000 replaces anything that pre-existed, and it seems to be very rapid, so that these Shona settlers with their cattle are able to move into the Highveld and very quickly establish, in effect, authority over it, over certainly earlier peoples. And by the 1200s, 13th century, The Shona are clearly the dominant group of pretty much the entire Highveld. And the areas to the southwest of that, up into the edge fringes of the eastern highlands, are all Shona speaking. While they were cattle keepers, and that clearly shaped political authority, somewhere in there it's socially accepted that the Mutapa, the king, once you have a kingdom, has authority over all cattle. So if you have cattle, he gave them to you. Somewhere, he gave them to you. And all that has to do is be accepted. It says something about the past, but again, we don't know about that. But we do know, even with that, of course, the majority of things people would have done was agriculture. And that clearly begins in a different way to transform the Highveld's environment. As you move towards eastern highlands, they started to terrace the land to make more agricultural land available. The environment was impacted, as in lots of traditional Africa, the Shona cleared the lands through field burning. So that shaped the environment, or changed the environment to some extent. They began to cut down trees, not only for housing, but clearly to make charcoal for ironwork. They grew rukwedza, which is finger millet, muhungu, which is bulrush millet, mafunde, which is sorghum, were their principal crops. And again, mostly the larger, denser populations are in the northeast, which have these very red, very beautiful, rich soils. But when Shangwa, drought in Shona, occurs, one historian says that with drought, Shona had to fall back on gathering in honey and flee to other areas. I think that's a bit of a strong, they clearly move. There's lots of history, even in the colonial period, when drought occurs, that the Shona people move communities, oftentimes, especially in the northeastern part, even as far away as in Mozambique. They were related to peoples there, pre-colonial times. And so they moved their communities to try to maximize their abilities to survive drought. So to say they fled, I think, is a bit of a strong statement. But we do know that the Shona peoples also developed a number of techniques to try to assuage the impact of drought. The Shona are generally said to have a sort of a unique grain storage little hut. If you've ever seen Great Zimbabwe, at one end is this gigantic conical tower. And that's symbolic of much smaller towers in each homestead that would have been built on stone to keep mice and those other animals away, but that are for grain storage. They certainly farmed. In bad times, they'd farm a lot, well, not in, but on the edges of those vlays that hold water longer. We know that at least one of its kingdoms, not to mention hunting gathering, they would trade gold. I'll get to that in a second. They certainly, by the 17th century with the Mutapa kingdom, they have, the kingdom organized drought relief programs to provide grain to peoples. So the drought was often enough that obviously a state steps in to assert its authority and legitimize its authority by storing grain. Some archaeologists have suggested that large conical tower at Great Zimbabwe simply is that. It's a large, symbolic of a large grain storage. It's full of rubble, but who knows? Spatially, they would have, the Shona families, a village is really made up of a bunch of homesteads, that are separated with their fields around them traditionally. It's not a village per se, like in West Africa, where it's all grouped together. Sorry. I have hearing aids, and sometimes I hear things, and I'm not sure if I'm hearing it or if it's what's going on, so it must have been something outside. Strange. I mentioned we know that by at least 1,000, maybe earlier, certainly by 12th, 13th, 14th century, the Shona are heavily involved in gold mining. There are pre-colonial gold mining sites throughout the Highveld. It was alluvial, although there's archaeological evidence that they would have dug, in effect, sort of pits, and it wouldn't go as deep as till you hit the water table, because then they would, of course, start to fill up with water. And these were open to any Shona. Commoners were allowed to keep dust, small things, whereas nuggets over a certain size went to the royal house. They also hunted and gathered ivory. In the 12th century, Mapungubwe, which was the first known state in the Highveld, begins to develop, and it seems that it and subsequent kingdoms are organized on controlling both the gold, really trading of the gold, trading of the ivory, but these lands, perhaps like the later kingdom, Winnetapa, in organizing relief. So they're trying to control the lands, and part of their argument is that it's a way to combat environmental problems. In the 13th century, you get the first state, Great Zimbabwe, as a linguistic historian, Chris Arrett, who is my principal mentor at UCLA, who, if I'm not mistaken, you guys just beat in basketball, but I'll forgive you for that, says is a true pre-industrial city, the first in southern Africa. It had a population at its height in the 14th, 15th century, probably, it may be up to 18,000 people, and so it's a tremendous drain on the areas around it for production. It was also the center, which would have shaped the environment, of a vast transhumance, a movement of cattle herds that were state-owned, that were both symbolic of the power of the state, but also, I think, by owning large herds of cattle, also try to guard against drought, those conditions of drought that the state controlled. Two final things about the colonial period, then I have to hurry up here, or about the pre-colonial period, is two things that are clearly associated with Zimbabwe that reshape the environment, don't occur certainly by the early 19th century. We know the one, and that would be the migration and settlement of the Ndebele people in the southwest, around what's modern-day Bulawayo. Was the capital of the Ndebele state. They come up from South Africa. Within a couple years of coming up in 1835, 36, they send some people back to the south, and people who had been clients of them in South Africa and had kept their cattle, they bring large herds of cattle up into the southwest. They also begin to farm relatively extensively, or at least the Shona people that they become overlords to farm those lands much more extensively, and we know from the latter third of the 19th century, you're starting to get in what's today Matabele land, soil erosion, land degradation, the loss of forest. And the other thing that probably came a little earlier, it's hard to tell exactly, that's maybe as early as the mid to late 1600s, is at best the first maize comes. Probably from Mozambique and up the Zambezi River Valley with the penetration of Portuguese, who make some fairs there. It may have come up from South Africa. We don't know exactly, but clearly, while initially maize begins to be included in sorghum and millet, by the 19th century, it's pretty clear that maize has become the dominant crop among the Shona, and to a certain extent begins to replace sorghum and millet. For instance, today you can get sadza, maize meal, throughout Zimbabwe, and just across the border in Botswana, it's still millet meal, not cornmeal. So those two things, and of course the cropping's different and the lands you can use and all that sort of thing. The colonial period, as I said, begins about 1890. As hopefully a second RAND. Those of you who have to go to class, that's how I can tell them. I don't know how your experience, when you have class, your students start putting their computer things down. It's like, oh, it must be time for me to stop. So thank you for coming. At least I know why they're leaving. It's all right. So the colonial period, as I said, it starts as the idea is to make it a second RAND. Cecil Rhodes, who was virtually the owner of the British South Africa Company, that is given the charter to colonize the area of Zimbabwe, sort of missed out on the exploitation of the RAND. Sort of thought, oh, there's diamonds, but there's who knows, gold, and so he wanted more of that. Certainly in the first couple decades, mining's important. I don't really want to look at that, except to say that we do know it has almost an immediate impact on the environment. For instance, 1909, so less than 2 decades after that initial settlement in 1890, a letter from a colonial official in the southwestern part of the Highveld. He wrote to the law department of the British South Africa Company that there are no trees in this district. The wood has all been cut down and burnt by the many miners which have been working in the district for the past 10 years. So for both the making of shafts and bracing of mines, but also for housing, firewood, all that sort of thing. It seems that in the Southwest, which were drier to begin with, that the native forest, indigenous forest, began to disappear with that first couple decades of the colonial period. By 1900, yeah.
Colonial, is it British?
Yeah, in Zimbabwe, from 1890 to 1923, it's actually the territory that becomes southern Rhodesia is actually under the political authority of the privately owned British South Africa Company. It had been given a charter in 1889 by the British government to exploit that area and what becomes Zambia and Malawi. In 1923, the white settlers are given a vote. Actually, in 1922, they're given a vote, and they vote to, instead of becoming a 5th province of South Africa, to have self-rule. And so a self-governing whites only, meaning for power structure, is given the right to govern. It's then under the colonial office of the British Empire that in theory had constitutionally had the right to reserve decisions, reverse any decision by the colonial government on anything that would affect the African populations. From then until 1965, when the whites declare their independence, the government never once, in England, never once vetoed a white law. And some of these I'll mention very briefly here. So yeah, so it's a British colony, but it's self-governing. by whites only.
The troops used were British troops?
No, the pioneer column was recruited from people in South Africa. No, all white. Well, there's some auxiliary, you know, cooks and that sort of thing. But Rhodes was very smart. He recruited to the what's called the pioneer column sons, some in England, sons of aristocrats, and certainly some that had been in South Africa recruits him because he figures, you know, if I just get a bunch of Afrikaner, you know, poor whites as he would have thought of them, in South Africa and move up there, if the Indabele wiped them out, and they certainly thought there was a possibility of that, then who cares? But if there's a few sons of aristocrats, then the British will send an army in to avenge that. So I get the territory regardless. Well, the Indabele don't do anything until 1893. They rebel. Again, it's mostly settlers and forces from South Africa. I think some are British troops initially, but put that down, and then in 1896, 97, which is the first Chimurenga in Zimbabwean history, they rise up against white rule and are suppressed, quite brutally actually, both Shona and Indabele. So technically British by nationality, but not officially British. They're private, it's a private enterprise. They're, the head of the government from 1890 to 1923 is called the administrator. He's an employee of the British South Africa Company. After that, it's a governor appointed from England. So let me mention two things that reshape the environment in the colonial period, and then we leave the other for question, I think. And that's two things that really reshape it. One that I want to mention, one is the creation of what in the colonial period were called native reserves, and then under the rule of Ian Smith and in the 60s and 70s, they rename them tribal trust lands, and then after independence, they're now called communal lands. But these are the lands that Africans were assigned to. I actually have an overhead, if it had been able to show up. If you take that Highveld, most of those reserves are on the edges of it. There are some in it, but those are only there, and the whole organization of these reserves, of these lands, were to provide labor for white enterprise, either farming or in the central part of the highlands in the northwest, commercial farming in the southwest, cattle ranching and some commercial farming, mostly cattle. And very quickly, those areas become, by 1920, for instance, it's reported that there's evidence of overcrowding, overstocking, soil erosion. So even by the 20s, about 25 years after the creation of the first reserves, the government, the white government, is well aware that these reserves are not large enough and that they're becoming overpopulated and degraded because of their size. It's not until 1930 that the government passes what's known as the Land Apportionment Act, where they increase African lands to about a little over 22% of the whole territory. Now understand in 1930 there are probably, I don't know, less than 100,000 whites still. I think that at the height of white, I think there were 270,000 whites in the early 1970s. So late 1920s, probably 80,000 at the most, probably somewhere around 6 to 7 million black Zimbabweans by then. And they get 22% of the land. The vast majority of that highland zone is designated as whites-only land. And to be on them, in them, you had, if you weren't on one of those little very small reserves, you had to have a pass that basically gave you 3 days off of a reserve before you had to find work, or you could be arrested and put in jail for vagrancy. But as I said, they become very, by 1951, the government passes what's called the Land Husbandry Act, which is an attempt, the government would say, well, we want to address the degradation of the reserves, and how do we do this? It's not that we've given Africans too small a lands, is that they haven't farmed them right. So we're going to realign how they live, and we're going to bring them into what's called rows. So you try to create a village on either side of a road, and probably a bottle store where you could get Orange Crush, I think, in Zimbabwe. And then you go out to your fields. They force destocking of the African lands. They've got too many cattle. They're still too imbued with this idea of cattle, all of which shows that they're not really ready to govern themselves. We want them to use proper furrowing and all that sort of thing, so we're going to send in agricultural specialists. Africans taught how to be good farmers, i.e. using white methods, so that these reserves will actually support the African populations. Of course, they never did. The second thing that the colonial period did that reshapes the environment radically is in 1907 they officially say, oh, thank you. It's got a sign. It's better. I was telling Melissa in Zimbabwe, I went to a workshop once. Lewis, he's at Texas, I think. He's still there, I think. They had brought in a bunch of people for this workshop at the University of Zimbabwe. It's in the mid-'80s when I was doing my field work there. And a bunch of us, me and a bunch of Zimbabwean students and a couple scholars that were at the archives, went over to, and Zimbabweans weren't allowed to participate. It's like, no, if you're not one of the invited guests, from England or the United States, you can't participate. But Lewis had an alarm clock that would go off. And, when the alarm goes off, you have 5 minutes. It was the bizarrest thing I've ever seen. Anyway, the other thing they do is, in 1907, they say, okay, officially, no gold. We're going to create what Robin Palmer called a white agricultural colony. So what do we sell off? Our lands to white farmers. You begin to promote white farming. The problem is as a man I talked to in the 1980s said, well, my family were farmers, but I was from the Midlands in England. I don't know how to farm what's going to grow in the tropics. What can you make commercially grow? The government enters into, and by 1910, 1911, establishes its first agricultural experimental station where they try different crops. They try cotton. They reject that until later in the century. What they settle on is tobacco. Virginia flu-cured tobacco. That's my book, The Most Promising Weed. So in Zimbabwe, I'm known as, when I went back after a while, I went to the department and the students, and my friend said, this is Dr. Rubert. You're the weed man. I said, do you know what that means in the States? I don't like to go by that too much, but although now I'm in Oregon where hemp is. Anyway, so what's the whole purpose of this colonial regime with this white settler? It's to try to figure out how can we exploit this environment? What grows best? An estates department is established. It says how much will they hire and governmentally support surveyors? How much land goes to a tobacco farm? I talked to a man who was both a tobacco farmer and been a surveyor, and he said, well, sometimes you get 500 acres, and I'll never forget it, that was the cat's meow, which means in the 30s, 40s, 50s, you're probably farming maybe, if you're a gigantic tobacco farm, maybe 100 acres of tobacco. But you have to change fields at least every other year. So you've got to have a minimum of 4 to 5 times that amount of just tobacco lands. So if you had 500 acres, it meant you had extremely productive land that you could come back to maybe every 3rd year. The average tobacco farm in Zimbabwe ends up being 2,000 acres. In addition to tobacco acreage, you have to have pasturage. And they have relatively large herds up until the 50s of oxen, because that's what you use a span of 16 oxen to pull plows. Obviously, that affects the environment. Areas are plowed over and planted in tobacco. Very rough crop on the soils. The other thing that farming does to the natural environment in particular is probably by the 1920s, and it really only officially gets, I think the first crop was sold in 1910 of tobacco, something like that, is that the natural woodlands are disappearing because tobacco, Virginia flue-cured tobacco, flues are pipes in the floor of these 2-story barns that you pick the leaves, put them in there, you string them, you hang them in there, and then you slowly raise the heat. They use tremendous amount of wood in the 20s, 30s, 40s. By the 50s, they're starting to develop coal fields northwest of the Highveld. And today there's lots of coal fields in that region. But so what do they have to do? They have to bring in and forest, in effect. They start bringing in Australian gum trees, eucalyptus trees that are very fast growing. Most reports are that they've, this invasive species, I mean, you see them everywhere in Zimbabwe now, everywhere, and not all that many indigenous trees. Side note, it's not quite in the Highveld, although the eastern fringes, as you go into the highlands, they also start in the 1930s pine forest to create paper industry. And it's amazing. And to support a factory that's in Harare that makes matchsticks, which I visited it and they wouldn't let us take pictures because of the high technology. They have machines from Germany that came in the 1950s, but no pictures, please, not in the factory. It's amazing. But I mean, those sorts of things, and it just totally transforms. Otherwise, Zimbabwe would have no wood. Simply in wood, I know I'm running out of time. Something I was looking at for this. A very recent study has said that since 1990, almost 22% of the woodlands of Zimbabwe have disappeared because of the high degree of afforestation. Oh, thank God it's not me. I tell my students to turn it off. Last term, I was the only one whose phone went off. It was extremely embarrassing. That's all right. My wife called me in the middle of a talk the other day. It was like, God. So deforestation is I mean, clearly a major problem. Some indication is to jump way ahead to these land seizures. Some indication is that with these land seizures, the deforestation is actually speeded up because people that were then assigned these lands that were taken over from commercial farmers, and in 2000, there were somewhere around 4,000 commercial farmers that owned 40% of the country on these large commercial farms. Those are taken over. Even the government of Zimbabwe has said there were mistakes made in that, and that the economic, environmental impact of those land seizures are greater than they had thought. That they've assigned these lands and they have been not been used productively, and to a large extent are either not being used at all in some cases, or people that got them who weren't farmers, and this is where it goes to the deforestation, have cut down more trees because, in effect, they want a place to live and something to cook. We also know that when was early 2000s, you have Operation Mora Machina, the throwing out the trash, where townspeople, many craftsmen, that the government wants to move out of the cities, and so they tear down a lot of homes in the high-density suburbs of the cities of Zimbabwe. Those people are forced back into the rural areas. They have no lands because they're seen as supporters of the opposition party. They're not given lands by local chiefs who tend to be supporters of the Mugabe regime. And so they've used wood very indiscriminately just to try to stay alive under these new regimes. So what do we have in terms of all of this? Clearly, I could go on forever, but even with it's really been marked. No one in Zimbabwe argues that land reform wasn't needed. It's a question of how it was done. That even by Zimbabwean law, it wasn't done legally, which of course is beyond the scope of this talk because it doesn't affect the environment, except to say that the forests do seem to be disappearing at a much quicker rate. It's just one example of the problem. There's a website I can give that shows where aerial picture of farmland that had been commercial farmland, and those farms are taken over, and you can see from these aerial views how they've become extremely degraded. White farmers, yes, were privileged economically, but by the 70s they're building dams and weirs to collect rain, which Zimbabwe didn't traditionally have natural collection of rains. And so they were able to transform. More progressive of the white farmers also then tried to move some of that infrastructure into neighboring African areas. All that's been largely destroyed. And the government clearly has, even some of those farm invaders now criticize the government that, look, you said you would give us infrastructural support, you would give us farm aid, better seeds, you would help develop more localized irrigation systems, and of course the government's done none of that. And perhaps the latest impact on the Zimbabwean environment of the Highveld is to the northeast, is of course diamonds have been discovered. And that area apparently, well, it's hard to say exactly what's going on because the government moved in and took it over, the army. And it's hard to get reports from that area, but it seems to be fairly destructive of the environment. They're shaking their head yes, so they probably know more than I do about it. But on the other hand, let me just end, because that's kind of negative. On the other hand, when it comes to the environment, which I hope you get some idea of how people have struggled with it and for it and how it's shaped it over the years a little bit, very generally. I almost get choked up. Zimbabweans are the most incredible people. Now, I know Burkina Faso, other parts of West Africa, so we all of us Africanists, we have our own, special love for where we do work and know people best. But the thing that gives me the greatest hope for Zimbabwe's future is its people. Because when there is a government that does respond and try to help small farmers, with better seed, with a little bit more fertilizer, with some better access. Maybe it's just boring more wells. I think Zimbabwe's a wonderful place. And in this Highveld region, like I said earlier, you can grow anything there. Anything. And Zimbabwe's just wonderful. my wife would go back, I'd live there half the year, I think. The poverty got to her, I think. But it's just, and it's because of the people. I mean, they're just wonderful, wonderful people and very hardworking, as across Africa. But with that natural environment that they have, with any kind of assistance at all, directed from the bottom instead of for the enrichment from the top, I have great hope for Zimbabwe's future. I really do. As bad as things have gotten the last decade, I have great hope that there'll be a new era. We could meet here in 20 years and have a new era, somebody else, but perhaps a new talk on the latest era of Zimbabwe's environment, and it'll be just a wonderful, wonderful report. Anyway, I could go on for days, but I won't. Questions? Yeah.
Overpopulation, is that a problem?
Most studies, I've seen studies that say as much as maybe a quarter of the population is now living outside Zimbabwe, largely in South Africa. I was in Botswana a year and a half ago, and I went before Easter. I'm a weird academic. I became Catholic a few years ago, and I'm like now this real religious guy to some extent. But liberation theology left this religious guy. Anyway, I was there, and I went to I wanted to go to Mass in Botswana on Easter, and I'm all ready, and I walked in early, and I hear this singing. The choir's practicing, going, wait, I know that song, and they're all Zimbabweans. And the priest comes in and says, well, you know, at last night's Saturday vigil, the night before Easter morning, our choir, you know, all the Botswanans, they were up till 4 this morning. So our Zimbabwean brothers, and there were hundreds in this church, all from Zimbabwe that have fled to a very large extent. If you take up to 90, no, I don't think there was I mean, I think the population in Zimbabwe got at its highest about, we're not sure, somewhere, maybe as many as 13 million. Probably somewhere between 11 and 13 million. But up until the mid-1990s, maybe the late 1990s, Zimbabwe was not only feeding itself, it was exporting crops. And after independence, a very large percentage of that were small black African Zimbabwean farmers. Their part of their share of the maize crop, for instance, just skyrocketed, and there was no food shortage in Zimbabwe, and I think the population could have kept growing. It's really political decisions, as across Africa, that impact the use of the environments that cause famine, and that's why Zimbabweans are starving to now. I mean, I think the last report I saw is 2 million, perhaps, could be starving out of a population of maybe 10. So, you know, and that's absurd for Zimbabwe. It's criminal for Zimbabwe. So in the regard of, can the territory feed itself? Yeah. So if that's a judge of how you judge overpopulation, I'd say no. So anyway, yeah.
Just wanted to ask a very interesting question, sort of related to the modern development, but it also sort of plugs in a bit to the pre-colonial and colonial eras. One of the growth spaces in Southern African historiography is now the history of water. And when you, as soon as you said eucalyptus, you know, the great villain of water, which they are actively trying to eradicate.
Well, they soak it up. They're like a sponge. That's why they grow so fast.
It was devastating in the Cape, but at the point where they actually train poor people and give them jobs going out into the forest and picking these eucalyptus out. They're basically trained to be botanists, so very limited scale, and to pull these things out. Is the sense, you know, first of all, that maybe this deforestation, despite the danger of soil erosion, might be having a positive effect in that regard, first of all, and second of all, is the fallow period, which I know to a certain degree is people giving land to our farmers, but also because there's no credit for inputs. There's no
Right.
machinery for harvesting, and so there are a lot of people who would be very, very good small farmers across Zimbabwe who are frustrated because they have no inputs and no money to buy them. Is there a sense that that sort of enforced fallow period may in fact be allowing the land to recover from some of the exhaustion of commercial farming placed on it that perhaps eucalypts placed on it by sucking out the water just by fixing the soil?
Mugabe regime is environmental regenerist. I had never thought of it that way.
Utterly unintentional.
I honestly don't know that much about that. It's an interesting thought. I do know that part of that right with land seizure, some of the greatest critics of land seizure, and they have to be extremely careful if they voice at all, are rural farmers that were on reserves that say, hey, why didn't our sons know how to farm? Why aren't we given lands? We're not. These guys are quote unquote war veterans and they weren't even born when the war ended. Or, I think in the first decade there was something like only somewhere around 50,000 families resettled on lands, first decade of independence, and the goal was considered very meager to begin with 150,000. A third of that was settled, and even then a large number of them, if you have a ZANU card, you get the land. So I mean, one of the worst things for me is one of the farms I interviewed on, with that all the workers were originally from Malawi, from the 1940s. That farm is now owned by Mugabe's sister. And all those people, God knows what's happened to them. And I got some great interviews from those people. I felt terrible. But Zimbabwean farmers that were smallholder farmers are some of the critics. Of course, they can't say much in the rural areas because it's very dangerous. But what's also clear, and which gives me hope for the future, is that it's clear they've also cut back on production because of a number of reasons. One, with the collapse of the commercial farms in the economy, it's not worth their while to do more than grow what they consume themselves. But one of the things with 2000 that's happened in Zimbabwe is the whole question of land rights and land ownership, title to land, has been thrown into the air. Now, to a very large extent on the communal lands, there was not private title anyway. But a lot of these farmers clearly are not sure that under the colonial period, if you made a place really productive, whites would take it over. Now will it be the government? So why should we produce? It'll be very, I mean, I don't know the answer to your question, to be quite honest, but I think it'll be very interesting to see if this, in effect, forced fallow period, because many of these fields, as I say, are being left unused because a lot of the early land takeovers were people flooding out from the cities going, oh, I'm unemployed in the city, great, this is my land. And they may have a little garden, but other than that, they really don't use it. Whether that will result in some sort of increased production when people who, I'm not saying that land should be taken back from those people, but if those people then are, through government assistance, taught how to use it and farm it, it'll be very interesting to see if production increases. Of course, on the commercial farms, you've had 50, 60 years of use of fertilizers and insecticides and everything to maximize production. And I think there are enough studies out that show that if you're not using those artificial things, the land will do better. The real question is, as you said, will a post-Mugabe government be willing to spend shall I be really catty? All those millions on something besides whatever he has now, a 20 or 30 bedroom house out on in the suburbs of Harare. Yeah, and Grace. Yeah, anyway. Yeah, if the money's used for other than ZANU purposes for small farmer support, like I said, I really think Zimbabwe, I think they could surprise the world in how fast they could come back to, at the very least, feeding themselves. And I mean, a lot of those farms have been broken up into maybe 5 to 10 hectare plots, 10, 12 acres. I think small farmers could do wonders on those lands with just a little input. Now, whether in other places, starting for instance in Kenya, governments that are supporting the planting of trees that are appropriate to the environment, I could see that happening in Zimbabwe very quick. Can you get rid of all the eucalyptus? That'll be a monumental task from what I could think of. It's absolutely amazing to drive around Zimbabwe, especially in the areas that were the tobacco farming areas, which is where I did my interviewing in the 80s. Yeah, there are just lots of, that's the weirdest thing about being a historian of the Zimbabwean colonial area, is when I was doing my field work in the 80s, I had no idea that I was actually studying a way of life, an economic system that would be history in 10 years. I mean, no one could have imagined that. Of course, Mugabe and this government was supporting white commercial farmers then, until the election of 98, 99, somewhere in there. 2000, yeah, was the referendum, 2000. You know, and the whites misplayed their hand entirely. You can't be seen taking all your farm workers to the polls and not have it step on your toes. But still, yeah, I had no idea that, it sounds weird as a historian to say I had no idea I was studying the past. I guess I had no idea I was living the past, but it is now. You had a question?
No, I just wanted to comment. I work in Mozambique on forestry and plantations and on the illegal logging that's going on there from the Chinese. And planting a tree is very political, whether it be a native species of yambo tree or a eucalyptus or a fruit tree. And because Mugabe has his guys out there in the rural areas who are in the area, if you were one of the people that got kicked out of the urban periphery and you're looking for a place, you can't really plant a tree without permission of the local leader. And then locally within the village, you can't really plant a tree without permission of the leader. So the way that landscape changes to native trees or to more plantations is going to depend on political authority. Very much.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, in terms of these plots, a lot of the folks who are farming, we can't really call them farmers because they also mine. They're spending some time in the city. You know, there's
They're trying to stay alive.
Yeah, there's this whole cycle. And so if there's these mines that are going on for, you know, diamonds in the east and little bits of gold here, you know, you're going to need the tree resources and the fire and everything to participate in those industries. And so I guess I would like to know from your opinion how it can be approached in a more sort of integrative way.
You know, I don't think I have it with me. I know I saw this is on the internet. Somebody once called me an electronic Luddite. I haven't ever broken a computer on purpose, but I just, the fact that I'm starting to look for things on the internet I consider most progressive. But there was something, and it was about Zimbabwe and I don't know if it's a local NGO. I think it is, out of, you know, headquartered in, I think, Harare, that is planting trees and clearly has government support for that. I do think Zimbabwe's hard to read these days. I do think there are people in the government, while what we hear on the outside, and they're generally portrayed as what Basil Davidson called domestic pirates. I do think there are people in there that maybe not ministers, that are concerned for Zimbabwe's future. And say to some extent, look, at the very least, we have to do some things locally to win the support of the people. It can't be total, the green bombers, the young thugs that are, they're unemployed teenagers given drugs and whatever, and it's just not good out in the rural areas.
The reversal of the water districts
Yeah.
in 2008. Went back to local.
So I do think there's a certain degree of, and you don't hear about those things, but I do think, or if you do hear about them, I think Mugabe has made it so easy to be so critical of Zimbabwe and what's going on. But I must be showing my age, but I think I've been around long enough or studied human society long enough to know that even repressive regimes, and clearly it is, have to do something for the people. You see this in the colonial period. They have to do something to say, not all the people are against us. And I do think this reforestation, to some extent, is an example of that.
Do you think it's received locally with open arms? Because in Mozambique, the government reforestation plan is viewed as a claim by the government to take over more land. Burning the trees down. I can't remember. God, I can't remember. I think the gist of the article was saying that because it's a local NGO, which isn't, I think it was an NGO, that isn't, a branch of the government, that they part of it is to train local peoples, is that it seems to be, isn't this a wonderful thing? And sort of, isn't it a surprise from the average of what you hear about Zimbabwe these days? So I took it as positive. I have to go back and see if I can find more about it. But yeah, it's hard to say. With the government is, yeah, it's certainly repressive. But I don't know. One of my history teachers, when I was an undergraduate, said, even lots of people, no matter what he did, lots of people still like Hitler. Which was saying for that particular culture, even an extremely repressive regime has to do something that benefits enough of the people of society that they're willing to support it for some reason. Yes, fear is part of it. But I do think Gono, if there's a Mugabe man, he's the head of the National Bank. He has said, 2 years ago, look, there were all kinds of mistakes and people aren't using the lands the way they should, and we have to redo this and rethink it, and who gets the land. Now, has anything been done? Not a whole lot that I've been able to see, but I've been accused more than once of having rose-colored glasses when it comes to Zimbabwe. I just love the place so much that I can't believe that it's not going to be better. And the Zimbabwean people are so, it's like, again, it's across Africa, but I know the Zimbabweans, they're so spiritual that you can't have a whole country that knows God's going to help and not have God help. I don't want to get religious and put that on you, but I think a lot of Zimbabweans see it that way, and it's like, well, yeah, things are terrible, but and I do think it's clear that some of the people, what's his name?
the former ZANU guy who ran in the last election. No, not Moyo. No. You can always tell where Moyo is. There's a flag waving, so the wind's going that way. And he's no, a general. Wasn't he a general? No, he was a Minister of Finance, former Minister of Finance. I think even if his branch was to win that power struggle within ZANU when Mugabe's gone, you could see all kinds of government support for local farming. Nobody's going. I mean, they're not going to go back to the large commercial farms. Most of those whites are farming in Nigeria or Malawi or Mozambique or Australia and doing quite well, thank you. But so that's not going to happen. But I think you could see even a ZANU government under that more neutral have support for farming. And again, like I said, in 20 years we have another paper, somebody else comes here and talks about, oh, the renewal of the Highveld Plateau, and talks about it producing more than enough to feed, not just Zimbabwe, but in SADC, Zimbabwe was designated as the food-producing country. Export stuff all over the place. So we can hope.
Well,
Sorry, I was just going to say that I'm afraid that I think we have to end.
Do we have to leave?
Yeah, I'm Daphne Gallagher. By the way, I co-organized the lecture series with Melissa, who introduced Dr. Rubert. We have inverse teaching schedule, so we're mid-lecture. But this has just been a fascinating talk, and thank you so much for coming. And we can maybe continue conversation briefly over coffee.
Sure.
Please help yourself, coffee and cookies. And I know that we have a whole series of meetings set up for Dr.
Yes, I do.
Rubert.
So I'm looking forward to talking to you as many as I can.
So thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.